President, and I rise to speak against the motion at hand which calls for the state government to declare supermarkets a regulated industry. In doing so, I'd like to first acknowledge that there are indeed enormous cost and living pressures facing many Victorians, especially when they head to the supermarket to buy this week's groceries. Now, the Allan Labor government recognises these cost of living pressures, and across multiple industries we've worked tirelessly to assisting struggling Victorians through initiatives such as the power saving bonus, short-term vehicle registration, free 3 and 4-year-old kindergarten, the Veterans Card, not to mention the revival of the State Electricity Commission, bringing down power bills through the government-owned renewable energy. These are real solutions to problems facing Victorians, and I am proud of the work our government has done to support the Victorian people over what has been an exceptionally difficult period, both through and post-COVID. And yet the Victorian Greens are now attempting to shove this poorly considered motion that would decimate supply and increase costs for essential supermarket goods. On both state and federal level of government, we have held major supermarkets such as Coles, Woolworths, Aldi and Metcash Food and Grocery, who own IGA, to account. All four have been signatories to the Food and Grocery Code of Conduct enshrined into law through the Competition and Consumer Act 2010 since 2015. This Code of Conduct has worked to increase commercial transparency, impose minimum standards on business practices and provide equitable dispute resolution, improving the bargaining power of suppliers and overall standards of business practices. On top of this, the Commonwealth Government is moving to tackle the issues head-on, with the Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, directing the ACCC to investigate the supermarket prices and appoint economist and former Minister for Trade, Dr Craig Emerson, to review the Code of Conduct. These are both excellent measures undertaken by the federal government. The best way to lower prices for Victorians will be through competition. More competition leaves us with a better off with lower prices, more variety, more supply, more choices and so forth. Now, competition is again a matter for the federal government, and as stated just now, the Commonwealth is already acting on these matters, and I think it would be inappropriate to presume their outcomes. I find it ridiculous that at a time and time again the Greens try and pass on state responsibilities to the federal scene and Commonwealth issues to the state government. Perhaps if they spent more time reading up on economic theory, the Australian Constitution, and less time making cringy TikTok videos, we might finally be getting somewhere. Now, Mr Pugliali in his motion raises that Section 4 of the Essential Services Commission Act 2001 gives the government power to declare that this industry be regulated, yet does not state whether, as it states in Section 4.1b, the existence of the regulatory benefits would exceed the administration and compliance costs of both becoming a regulated industry. To put it in more simple terms, the motion before us has not stated whether or not these new regulatory controls will cost Victorians consumers more. This really matters to Victorians who might be burdened with the increased costs of regulations in their weekly grocery shop trip. The motion talks big about the cost of living pressures Victorians face, then calls for action that may very well raise the cost of groceries. Declaring supermarkets and groceries to be government-regulated industry will ultimately do more harm than good. First and foremost, any decision taken by the state government will contradict the policies in existence by the federal government, such as the aforementioned Competition and Consumer Act. It is patently ridiculous for this matter to be brought to the Victorian Legislative Council with the potential to conflict with the activities of the federal government and to risk an endless line of bureaucratic disputes and delays that leave Victorian consumers without access to affordable essential goods. The motion seems to omit the reality that the administrative and compliance costs of regulating these large corporations will be passed on to consumers in the form of staff and auditing costs, changes in marketing and pricing, application approval delays, and more in accordance with the Australian Government's regulatory burden measures framework. This would negate any perceived potential cost reduction that is poorly considered motion implies, and demonstrates a clear lack of understanding of economics and regulatory processes. We would lose job opportunities for young people entering the workforce for the first time through dramatic loss in business profits, denying them crucial opportunities, experience and access to markets crucial for stepping into adulthood, such as housing and rent. Furthermore, by regulating the prices of goods, we will reduce profits for Australian suppliers. Farmers and manufacturers are integral to the Victorian economy. Without them, we would simply be nothing to buy at the supermarkets. But something that may have passed over their heads is some of the farmers and manufacturers in this state are experiencing cost of living and inflationary pressures the same as ordinary Victorians. Regulating supermarket prices through government intervention simply passes the costs on to them. Farmers and other workers who work tirelessly to provide all of us that are not so greedy, profit-hungry class, they're ordinary, decent people making an honest living in this state. And this motion, in all its ignorance, wants to impose higher costs on them, ultimately decimating the supply of goods available for Victorians. Another matter, President, that hasn't been taken into consideration is that further down the supply chain is transport. And if you want to pass on additional costs in the transport industry, that will lead to more deaths on the road that is currently happening as the Transport Workers Union continue their fight against the safe rates in the national jurisdictions. So the cost of living pressures are also worsened by difficult conditions that our state has been subject to over the past few years, such as natural disasters, seasonal issues, pandemic recovery and more. Producer supply is often impacted by bushfires, droughts and floods, leaving supermarkets without market for locally produced goods. These situations inevitably impact supply, which lead to the unexpected cost for supermarket providers through no fault of their own. This motion again makes the blanket statement that corporations are increasing their profits with no nuance. By regulating supermarket prices without consideration for these extenuating circumstances, we will be throwing businesses, suppliers and consumers all under the bus. Our farmers and manufacturers are an integral part of our state economy and deserve to see reasonable returns for their work. And this motion would risk creating a shortage of products available by reducing the incentive to sell or invest in the market. It is a basic question of supply and demand that will lead to the increased costs for Victorian consumers, rather contrary to the aims stated by Mr Pugliardi's motion. No matter what the Victorians may think, the iron laws of economics reign true in this state, and they just as they do anywhere. The imposition of further controls on prices is not going to lead to what Mr Pugliardi believes. There are consequences to unreasonable and harsh controls on any industry, but let's not go through what happens there. We already know from poor considerations of this motion that there is going to be an increased cost for supermarkets from regulations. No business is going to just cop the cost on the chin and keep going. Maybe the Victorian Greens live in the alternate reality to myself, but I've always seen what happens. The cost will be offloaded to consumers and suppliers. Farmers will be paying more and more to supply their goods, and consumers will be hit with higher and higher prices at the checkout. And this is supposedly going to help Victorians. I don't believe ordinary people should cop it, and cop an already steep weekly grocery bill just to feed the Victorian greed's insatiable yearning for more and more regulation. This is nothing more than a bland Greens ideological piece that wants more government intervention for the sake of intervention rather than the corrective measures. I know what the Victorian Greens will say, that we would use the regulation to control prices, but newsflash, prices controls don't work. We know that that leads to all too well is empty shelves, first come, first serve, as suppliers can no longer afford to supply at the same rate to artificially low prices. It's Economics 101, with major economists and policymakers all united against this ridiculous over-the-top measure. I'd also like to note the Australian Council of Trade Unions, in their inquiry into price gouging final report recently published this month, a highly comprehensive detailing of the factors in supermarket cost increases, explicitly does not make recommendations towards price control or regulation. Nor do we expect expert economics or research institutes such as the Grattan Institute, who advocate for exactly what the Allen Labor government is doing, directly support for Victorians who are struggling, increase to job seeker and offering provision for subsidies such as free kinder and power bonus. I am unsure as to why the Victorian Greens would propose a motion against the recommendation of union leaders, economists and industry experts. We know everyone with the expertise in this area is opposed to the idea of price control as such heavy-handed, blunt regulatory crackdowns, and we know by doing so to jack up the costs of living pressures on working families and suppliers. There is no scenario which motion leads to better outcomes and leads to consumers taking a hit in their wallets, farmers having less cash in their pockets, less jobs and empty shelves. It is not the role of the state to intervene in the business of practices except as a last resort, due to the risks that all come along with this, and I urge the strong opposition to this motion.